The aircraft landed with a heavy thud, and Captain James Harper experienced a surge of relief and excitement coursing through him. He had endured the past 8 months in the harsh mountains of Afghanistan, leading his troop through gun battles and surprise attacks, sustained by sheer adrenaline and resolve. Now, as he stepped onto domestic ground, all he could focus on was reuniting with his wife, Kimberly. He had envisioned this moment countless times: the tender hug, the gentle kiss, the sense of home enveloping him like a cozy blanket. As he navigated through the airport, his heart pounded with joy. He noticed Kimberly waiting by the arrival gate, her golden hair shimmering in the light, exactly as he recalled. Yet there was something off. Her smile, typically radiant and loving, appeared forced, almost robotic. He dismissed the sensation, attributing it to the oddness of their prolonged separation. After all, they had both evolved during these months, hadn't they? "Hey, you," James exclaimed, embracing her tightly. The contact felt odd, her frame rigid, her arms reluctant. He pecked her on the forehead, but she slightly turned away, enough for him to perceive. "Welcome home," she murmured, her voice just louder than a hush. There was no warmth, no enthusiasm, merely words hollow and stripped of the affection he had yearned for. On the drive home, James attempted to lighten the mood, sharing tales from his time abroad, the unity among his comrades, the close calls and triumphs. However, Kimberly remained aloof, her replies brief and ambiguous. She kept her gaze fixed on the road, nodding at appropriate times, but it was evident her thoughts were elsewhere. Upon reaching their humble abode, James was struck by a feeling of discomfort. The house was spotless as usual, but felt unwelcoming, almost sterile. The framed photographs on the walls, snapshots of their wedding, vacations, and joyful times they had shared, now seemed like artifacts from another era, another existence. Kimberly ushered him inside, her actions swift and perfunctory, as if performing a routine rather than greeting him back. She indicated that she had cooked his preferred dish, but her tone lacked delight or pride. James endeavored to suppress the unsettling suspicion in his core, convincing himself that reconnection would require time after such a lengthy parting. Yet, as days passed, the gap between them widened. Kimberly was perpetually on her phone, either messaging or browsing social media, even during moments meant for them. She would leave the residence for extended periods under the guise of meeting friends or running errands, always returning late with elusive justifications that didn't quite convince. James, ever meticulous and detail-focused from his military tenure, began to detect other hints, minor on their own, but collectively forming a troubling image. At night, as Kimberly turned her back to him and breathed steadily, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. The affectionate reunion he had imagined was gradually being replaced by an escalating sense of alarm. Something was profoundly amiss. James understood that the battlefield wasn't the sole arena where he needed to fight for survival. The day had been ordinary, the type James once relished following the turmoil of deployment. He had dedicated most of it to fixing things around the house, trying to reintegrate into the routine of civilian life. Kimberly had said she would be out with friends that evening, so he opted to address a task he had been postponing: a leaking pipe in the basement. The basement was permeated with the familiar odors of moist concrete and aged timber. James crouched by the pipe, his hands occupied with the wrench, yet his thoughts continuously drifted back to Kimberly. The unease that had enveloped him since his return lingered. As he toiled, the sound of footsteps above snapped his attention. He stopped, listening carefully. Kimberly had returned home sooner than anticipated. He could discern her movements in the kitchen, the clatter of glass, and the rustle of packaging. Then her voice, a voice he hadn't encountered in what seemed like forever, drifted down the stairs. It was cheerful and buoyant, starkly contrasting the frosty, aloof tone she had adopted with him lately. Driven by curiosity, he set the wrench on the floor and stealthily approached the base of the stairs. His military background had equipped him with stealth, a capability sharpened by years of service. Each step he took was deliberate, every action precise as he ascended the stairs, ensuring he remained silent. From a concealed spot, just out of view, her voice was clear now. She was on a call, her tone filled with eagerness. "I can't wait to see you again," she chuckled, a sound that struck him like a blade to his heart. "He's mostly out anyway. You should have seen his expression when I told him I was heading out with the girls tonight," she laughed. The naive fool believed me. James's blood chilled, he hung on her every word, his heart pounding loudly in his ears. She was discussing him, ridiculing and demeaning him. With each heartbeat, a thunderous drum in his chest, and Kimberly went on, her voice imbued with malicious joy, "He's the ultimate male. He can continue 6 times without a break. My foolish husband pales in comparison to him. We've already schemed to ditch that loser. It's only a matter of time." The words lingered, echoing in James's mind like a knell. He stood immobilized, his hands quivering as the grim reality dawned on him. The woman he had entrusted with his life intended to deceive him, to obliterate him. His thoughts swirled. How long had this been unfolding? How had he been so oblivious, so gullible? The fury simmering within started to boil. His hands balled into fists. Every part of him screamed for vengeance, for confrontation, yet he understood he needed to think logically. This wasn't a conflict where brute strength prevailed. This was a battle of wits, of tactics. James compelled himself to retreat downstairs, his mind whirling. The man who had commanded troops under enemy fire, who had confronted death on numerous occasions, now found himself in the basement of his home, quivering with a fury he struggled to control. But one thing was clear, this was far from concluded. James sat in the dim basement, the cold from the concrete floor penetrating his body, the silence around him profound, only disrupted by the soft buzz of the house's electrics. His heart, however, was anything but quiet. It throbbed in his chest like a battle drum, each beat fueled by a fury unknown to him before. This wasn't the ire of a soldier in combat. This was something more profound, more personal. The words he had eavesdropped on replayed in his mind, each a sharp shard slicing through his soul. "He's the ultimate male. He can keep going 6 times without a break. My foolish husband is nothing in comparison." Kimberly's voice, once a beacon of comfort and love, had transformed into a cruel parody of everything he cherished. The woman he had adored, fought for, and longed to return to had betrayed him in the most heinous manner possible. James's hands tightened into fists, his knuckles white from the strain. He had survived battles, witnessed comrades fall, endured ambushes and firefights that should have claimed his life, but nothing had braced him for this. This wasn't a battle he could conquer with a precise shot or a smart tactic. This was a conflict of emotions, a struggle within his own household, and he had been taken by surprise. His thoughts raced, sifting through the years of their marriage, searching for signs he might have overlooked: the late nights, the sudden loss of interest in their conversations, the way she had begun to distance herself long before he had departed for his last deployment. It all seemed so evident now, as if he had been living in a haze, too engrossed in his duties to notice his own life falling apart around him. James compelled himself to take deep, measured breaths. He couldn't let the rage overtake him, not yet. He needed to think, to strategize. He had spent years in the military, learning to master his emotions, to direct them towards something constructive, something that would keep him alive. Now, he had to do the same, but this time the battlefield was his own home. "They think I'm a fool," he thought bitterly. "They believe I'm some naive husband too caught up in my own affairs to see what's happening right before me, but they were mistaken, so deeply mistaken. They had misjudged him, underestimated his capacity for cold, calculated revenge. They thought they could replace him, discard him as if he were insignificant. But they had no idea who they were dealing with." James stood up, his movements slow and intentional, every muscle in his body taut, with barely controlled anger. His mind was already active, formulating a plan, a tactic. This wasn't going to be a mere confrontation where he'd burst in, demand answers, and express his anger. No, that would be too straightforward, too rapid. He wanted them to suffer, to experience the same agony and betrayal he felt. He wanted to dismantle their lives piece by piece until all that remained was the residue of their treachery. "You think I'm a fool," he thought, a grim smile forming on his lips. "You're about to realize just how incorrect you are." James walked up the stairs, his mind focused on what he had to do. He was no longer just a soldier returning from combat. He was a man betrayed, a man wronged, and he was about to demonstrate what true betrayal looked like. The fury inside him wasn't just simmering, it was transforming into something much more potent. It was becoming determination. The hours dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity as James awaited Kimberly's return. His anger smoldered beneath the surface, cold and deliberate. He could hear the front door creak open upstairs, followed by the soft sound of her footsteps as she entered the house. She paused in the hallway, undoubtedly noticing the ominous silence that had settled over the home. James awaited her in the living room, seated on the sofa, his expression unreadable. The only illumination in the room came from a solitary lamp, casting long shadows that flickered across the walls. Kimberly stepped into the room, her eyes widening in astonishment when she saw him sitting there, wide awake. She quickly regained her composure, but he caught the brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "You're still up?" she inquired, her voice as sweet as always, concealing whatever emotions lingered beneath the surface. James forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, couldn't sleep. Thought we should talk." Kimberly's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded, crossing the room to sit opposite him. Sure, what about James didn't indulge in idle chatter? He leaned forward, his gaze piercing into hers. "Are you happy, Kimberly?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked, her smile faltering as she processed his words. "What? Of course I am. Why?" "Would you ask that?" Because James said slowly, rising and taking a step toward her. "I overheard your conversation earlier, the one where you were laughing about how foolish I am and how wonderful your lover is." The color drained from Kimberly's face, leaving her pale and stricken. Her mouth opened and closed, her eyes wide with shock and fear. But before she could finish, James's fist connected with her mouth, the force of the blow knocking her out of the chair and onto the floor. She screamed, a sharp, piercing sound as pain spread through her jaw. Blood pooled in her mouth, spilling onto the carpet as she clutched her face in horror. James towered over her, his expression cold and unfeeling, like a soldier confronting a defeated foe. "You think I'm a fool, Kimberly? You think you can mistreat me like that?" Kimberly attempted to scramble away, her hands slipping in the blood as she struggled to stand, but James was on her instantly. His hand clasped her hair, yanking her back as she cried out in pain, her body quivering as she realized there was no escape. "I'm not done with you yet," he growled, his voice low and threatening. He hoisted her up, forcing her to face him, the terror in her eyes mirroring the cold, calculated fury that had engulfed him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The house, once a sanctuary, was now a battleground, and James was resolved to emerge victorious. He had endured too many conflicts, survived too many confrontations to let this betrayal slide. As he glared at the woman he had once cherished, he understood that the struggle was far from concluded. Kimberly lay crumpled on the floor, her body shaking, tears mixing with the blood dripping from her mouth. The physical agony was intense, but it was the fear in her eyes that afforded James a perverse sense of gratification. His initial outburst had been raw, a gut reaction to the deep betrayal he felt. However, as he towered over her, the cold, calculating part of his mind assumed control. He knew a single act of violence wouldn't satisfy the depth of his wrath. No, what he desired was far more severe. He aimed to dismantle her life bit by bit, to devastate her world as she had devastated his. James seized her arm, pulling her up with a brutality that made her gasp. He forced her to meet his steely gaze. "You think you can just leave me for him, start anew while I fade into oblivion?" His voice was low, each word infused with venom. Kimberly, her voice shaky and faint, tried to plead with him. "James, please." "I shut up," he interrupted, shoving her away with a disdainful sneer. "You're going to pay for this, Kimberly, and so will your lover. You both think you're invincible, but you have no idea what I'm capable of." Over the next few days, James's rage evolved into a focused, meticulous drive for vengeance. He became methodical, treating the situation like a military operation. He planned everything to the last detail, ensuring that nothing would trace back to him. He was intent on destroying them both, but he would do so in a manner that left them with no escape, no hope, and no future. His first step was to access all the evidence he could. He hacked into Kimberly's phone, a skill he had acquired during his military service, and began sifting through her digital life. Every text, every voicemail, every photo, he scrutinized it all, piecing together the timeline of her infidelity. He discovered the name of her lover, Mark, a self-assured corporate executive who likely believed he was untouchable. James's anger intensified as he read their messages brimming with future plans and cruel jabs at his expense. However, merely knowing wasn't sufficient. James yearned to do more than just expose them. He wanted to annihilate them. He began by compiling the most damning evidence and sent it anonymously to Mark's wife. He envisioned the shock, the upheaval that would ripple through Mark's life. The affair would become public, leading to a scandalous, humiliating divorce that would damage his reputation and deplete his resources. James didn't stop there. He delved deeper into Mark's life, uncovering every secret, every dubious business deal. It wasn't long before he found incriminating contracts and illicit payments to government officials. James leaked this information to the press, ensuring that Mark's career would be ruined. But this was just the beginning. James was relentless, setting up fake social media profiles to spread falsehoods and defamation about both Kimberly and Mark. He meticulously crafted posts and comments that painted them as deceitful, manipulative, and dishonest. Their friends and family began to distance themselves, swayed by the toxicity James had released into their lives. The isolation took its toll, and James reveled in knowing they were both suffering under the weight of public scrutiny and personal distress. Everywhere they turned, they encountered hostility and suspicion. Their once comfortable lives were unraveling, their reputations in ruins, their social circles constricting around them. James observed it all unfold with a cold satisfaction, aware that his vengeance was far from complete. He wanted them to endure the slow, agonizing destruction of everything they cherished, just as they had inflicted on him. As he sat back, his scheme in motion, James felt a dark, grim sense of fulfillment. This was not solely about revenge, it was about reclaiming control, about ensuring they could never harm him or anyone else again. The fallout from James's meticulously crafted plan started gradually, like the initial cracks in a dam, but once those cracks expanded, the dam broke, unleashing a deluge of ruin upon Kimberly and Mark's lives. Each day brought a new wave of consequences, each more catastrophic than the last. Kimberly's troubles began at work. Whispers and sideways glances followed her through the halls. Colleagues who had once been friends now maintained their distance. The rumors spread swiftly, rumors of her affair, of the scandalous details that had somehow leaked. The atmosphere turned suffocating. She was summoned to her boss's office, where she was met with stern faces and an air of finality. They did not mince words. Her reputation had become a liability, and they could not afford the scandal. She was fired on the spot, escorted from the building like a criminal. The isolation was immediate and crushing. Friends she had once confided in stopped answering her calls. Her social media accounts were flooded with scorn and mockery. Every door she tried to open slammed shut in her face. She was left alone, jobless, and drowning in the fallout of her own decisions. The man she had planned to leave James for was now her only lifeline, and even that was slipping away. Mark's downfall was even more public. The anonymous tip about his extramarital affair landed in his wife's inbox with brutal clarity. She didn't wait for explanations or apologies. Divorce papers were served within days, and the story spread like wildfire through their social circles. The news reached his workplace, where his colleagues and superiors treated him like a pariah. His professional life crumbled just as quickly. The leaked information about his business dealings hit the press, leading to investigations and lawsuits. His company distanced itself from him, and clients withdrew their contracts. The empire he had built on deception and greed was collapsing, leaving him disgraced and destitute. James watched from a distance, his face a mask of cold detachment. He had orchestrated every detail, pulled every string, and now he was witnessing the fruits of his labor. However, the satisfaction he felt was hollow. The anger that had driven him, the pain that had fueled his actions, had not dissipated. It lingered, a dark shadow over his thoughts. He had taken everything from them, but the emptiness within him remained. Despite the destruction he had wrought, James wasn't finished. He wanted to see their faces, to witness the moment they realized who had orchestrated their downfall. He needed that final, crushing blow to truly feel vindicated. So he devised one last move. He reached out to Kimberly and Mark separately, crafting a message that played on their desperation. He framed it as a chance for closure, a final conversation to talk things out and perhaps find a way forward. The invitation was for a secluded cabin, a place where they could meet away from the prying eyes of the world that had turned against them. Kimberly, with no job, no friends, and no future, was desperate for any chance at redemption, any hope that this nightmare could be resolved. Mark, his life in tatters, clung to the hope that this meeting could salvage something from the wreckage. Both of them, broken and defeated, accepted the invitation, unaware that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. James meticulously prepared the cabin, ensuring every detail was perfect. He arrived early, checking the arrangements, making sure everything was in place for the final act of his revenge. The cabin was simply furnished. The the main feature being a single chair positioned opposite a large stone fireplace. On the wooden table beside him, a handgun lay, its cold metal faintly glinting in the dim light. James sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames as they danced and flickered, their warmth doing nothing to thaw the icy resolve that gripped his heart. He had replayed this moment countless times in his mind, preparing for every possible scenario. Now, all that remained was to see it through. The sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the silence, followed by the faint slam of car doors. James didn't move, his gaze fixed on the flames. The door creaked open, and he heard the hesitant footsteps of Kimberly and Mark as they entered the cabin. They stopped abruptly when they saw him sitting there, the gun in plain view. "Sit down," James ordered, his voice devoid of emotion, as cold and commanding as a general addressing his troops. They hesitated, exchanging fearful glances, but the silent threat of the weapon was enough to make them comply. They took their seats, their movements stiff and jerky, like puppets on frayed strings. James finally turned to face them, taking in their appearances. Kimberly, with her tear-streaked face, looked nothing like the woman who had once held his heart. Mark, once so confident and self-assured, now appeared small and defeated. They were shadows of their former selves, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on them like a physical force. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" James asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to be betrayed like that?" Kimberly's eyes filled with tears, her voice quivering as she tried to plead with him. "James, please, we're sorry, we're—" James cut her off with a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and mirthless. "You're sorry. You weren't sorry when you were laughing about me behind my back. You weren't sorry when you were planning to leave me for him." His gaze shifted to Mark, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "And you thought you could just waltz in and take what's mine. You thought you were better than me." Mark's lips moved as if he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. He was too terrified to do anything but nod weakly, his face pale and drawn. James stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was savoring the moment. He began pacing in front of them, his mind a storm of emotions. The power of the situation, the control he held over them, sent a cold surge of satisfaction through him, but it wasn't enough. He needed them to understand the depth of their betrayal, the enormity of the pain they had caused. "You know," James began, his voice measured, "when I was out there risking my life for this country, I used to think about home, about you, Kimberly. You were my anchor. The thought of coming back to you kept me going, kept me sane. But now I see it was all a lie." He stopped pacing and turned to face them directly, the intensity of his stare making them both flinch. "You betrayed me in the worst way possible, and for what? A cheap thrill, some fantasy about an alpha male? You don't even know what real strength is." James reached for the gun, his hand closing around the grip. Kimberly gasped, her body trembling uncontrollably, while Mark sat frozen, his eyes wide with fear. "James, please," Kimberly whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't do this." James looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Don't do what? You think I'm going to kill you? No, death would be too easy, too quick. You both deserve to suffer, to live with the consequences of your actions." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, but then added, "I want you to understand something. I could end this right now. I could pull this trigger and it would all be over for you. But that would be mercy, and you don't deserve mercy." James slowly placed the gun back on the table, leaning closer to them. "What you're going to do is live with the knowledge that you've lost everything, your reputations, your careers, your friends, your families, everything you've built, everything you've worked for, gone, because you couldn't keep your desires in check." He straightened up, his gaze still fixed on them. "You're going to walk out of here and live with that shame for the rest of your lives. And if you ever think about coming after me, remember this moment. Remember that I hold all the cards. I have the evidence, the power, and the will to ruin you even further if I choose." Kimberly was sobbing uncontrollably now, her hands covering her face as the full weight of their situation crashed down on her. Mark looked utterly defeated, his expression hollow, as if the life had been drained out of him. They had been completely outmaneuvered by the man they had once mocked and underestimated. "Get out," James said quietly, but with an edge that made them both jump. "Get out of my sight and don't ever come near me again." They scrambled to their feet, desperate to escape the cabin and the man who had destroyed their lives. As they rushed out, tripping over themselves in their haste, James watched them go, a strange sense of calm settling over him. The storm of rage and pain that had driven him was finally subsiding, leaving behind a cold, calculated clarity. He had taken his revenge, and now, as he stood alone in the quiet cabin, he realized that he had become something else entirely, something far more dangerous than the man they had betrayed. In the days that followed the confrontation, a heavy silence descended upon James's life. The world outside continued as usual, but for him, everything had changed. He spent his days in a state of cold detachment, a far cry from the man he had once been. The remnants of his old life, the life he had shared with Kimberly, was swiftly being dismantled. James wasted no time in filing for divorce. He approached it with the same ruthless efficiency he had applied to his revenge. He had gathered enough evidence to ensure that the settlement would be entirely in his favor. There would be no alimony, no shared assets, no mercy. Kimberly would walk away with nothing, a fitting end to the betrayal she had engineered. When he finally met with his lawyer, the man had been struck by the lack of emotion in James's demeanor. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a cold, calculating resolve. James signed the papers with a steady hand, the act feeling more like closing a business deal than ending a marriage. He left the lawyer's office without a backward glance, knowing that the finality of the divorce would soon be another nail in the coffin of Kimberly's ruined life. The house was the next thing to go. Every room, every corner held memories, tainted now by the betrayal that had unfolded within its walls. James couldn't bear the thought of staying there, of living in a place that had become a mausoleum for his old life. He put it on the market, pricing it to sell quickly, and within weeks it was gone. The house was bought by a young couple, eager to start their life together, unaware of the dark history that came with it. James left with only the essentials, determined to leave as much of the past behind as possible. He relocated to a new city, one where no one knew him or his story. It was a clean slate, a chance to rebuild himself from the ground up. The anonymity of the city was a balm to his wounded pride. He found a modest apartment, decorated it sparsely, and set about establishing a new routine. He threw himself into his work, using the structure and discipline of his military training to keep himself focused. But even as he built this new life, a part of him remained anchored in the past, in the cold satisfaction of his revenge. James didn't completely sever his connection to Mark, though. He kept tabs on him from afar, watching as the man's life continued to unravel. The scandals that James had set in motion had taken on a life of their own, spiraling out of control. Mark was compelled to resign from his position, his reputation irreparably harmed, his marriage, already on the verge of collapse, crumbled completely, culminating in a bitter, protracted divorce. Mark was left with nothing but the remnants of his once prosperous life, his fall from grace complete. However, James was not satisfied with letting them simply fade into obscurity. He wanted their suffering to be a continuous reminder, a haunting ghost that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Thus he concocted a method to keep their wounds raw. He sent anonymous letters to Kimberly, cruel reminders of what she had lost and brought upon herself. These letters were always timed impeccably, arriving just when she might have thought the worst was over. Emails were sent to Mark, filled with venomous taunts about his downfall, each a reminder of the man who had orchestrated his ruin. James even arranged for a few carefully placed news articles, subtle enough to seem coincidental but potent enough to keep their disgrace in the public eye. With each reminder, each cruel twist of the knife, James felt a dark satisfaction. He had obliterated their lives, but it wasn't enough to simply walk away. He wanted them to know that their pain, their suffering, would never truly end. They would carry it with them always, just as he carried the scars of their betrayal. As time went on, James found a twisted peace in his new life. The anger that had once driven him had cooled, replaced by a deep, enduring sense of control. He had reclaimed his life, his power, and he had done so on his own terms. But in the quiet moments when the world around him was still, he couldn't escape the feeling that something vital had been lost in the process. The man he had been, the man who had loved and trusted so deeply, was gone, replaced by someone colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous.